Hi, everyone. Dr. Stein on What If It's Not Depression podcast. I'm your host, and we are going to be talking about psychedelics. Hold on to your seats. And if you like this episode, please hit subscribe and click the like button. So we are going to be talking to Maya Shetreat, and she is a neurologist, herbalist, urban farmer, ceremonially. I cannot say this word, ceremonialist, and author of The Dirt Cure and the newly released book called The Master Plant Experience, The Science, Safety, and Sacred Ceremony of Psychedelics. She has been featured in the New York Times, the Telegraph, NPR, Sky News, the Dr. Oz Show, and more. Dr. Maya created Quantum Drops, a vibrational master plant product that is safe, legal, and deeply transformative. She is also the founder of the Terrain Institute, where she offers a training for psychedelic-informed practitioners, as well as an upcoming quantum practitioner certification. Woohoo! And if you guys want the Quantum Drops, there will be a link in the show notes and email that will transmit this podcast to you. So welcome, Maya.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's so great. I know it's been hard to get you into our schedule with your busy schedule. So I really, really appreciate you coming and talking about what you are so passionate about. And it was the dirt cure and everything about the microbiome and dirt. And now you're talking about psychedelics, and you wrote a book and you have a certification. So what got you into this? What happened that made you start thinking about psychedelics and getting to this place?
Well, I think it's it's funny because I don't really see what I was doing as that different from what I am doing and what I was talking about to what I am talking about, which is really just exploring different angles of everything is connected to everything.
Mm-hmm.
And and just these like fundamental relationships and this sense of kinship and reverence and belonging that we all crave, right? And we can find that from the standpoint of the dirt cure, and we kind of understand it through things like the microbiome, communicating with our mitochondria, which is, part of how we are part of this beautiful symphony, where things that seem totally unrelated are connected, like our gut and our brain, or our immune system and hormones, or. And then on the side of psychedelics, I really didn't get involved from an interest in psychedelics. What I became interested in was indigenous healing and master plants. And that's why the book is called The Master Plant Experience, because it's really about this concept of master plants. And we can talk about the difference between psychedelics and master plants, or, how they kind of are related, but it has to do with our relationship with, you know, ancient wisdom, with powerful plants, with this idea of our ancestors and um, how we're connected, being beyond just human to human, but also human to plant and animal and
Mm-hmm.
nature, right? So I'm probably getting a little radical already, which, but what I feel my calling is in medicine and beyond is really to explore these radical connections that people are sort of maybe don't see or not that aware of, or maybe interested in even, and sort of looking from an indigenous science standpoint and a modern conventional science standpoint. How can those two things be married together? How is there kind of overlap in the Venn diagram, and how do we create a lexicon to explore these connections? Because I think there's a lot of potency and potential for healing in that overlap.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you that and I think it's important to explore that and find ways to explain it to the average person, right? Because so it's, I think it's in the science, starting with the science and connecting the dots to people, for people, really helps to understand these things. So I would, love for you to just dive right in and talk about psychedelics. I know, like, psychedelics, we're taught that psychedelics were illicit drugs, for such a long time. So, why do you think that doctors are now talking about them as a legitimate treatment? And if you need to bring something, talk about something prior to that, answering that question, go right in. But, just set up a foundation and answering that question, feel free. Yeah.
Yeah, I think just to your point of like the average person, I just want to like, I want to kind of contextualize that a little bit because I think, as physicians or healthcare practitioners, we think of ourselves as experts. And what I've learned, um, and I've pointed this lens at myself,
Mhm.
certainly, willingly and maybe not so willingly. And I also kind of think of this as I'm talking, when I say maybe I don't know if I would have used the average person, but I know exactly what you mean. It's really about
Mhm.
unlearning. And so being an expert, being a PhD or an MD or any of these very like amazingly lofty goals and, having this expertise and all of that, there's a way it actually is very limiting. And
Mhm.
it can be limiting in our identity, which, I've explored a lot as like someone who talks about things that are sort of radical for a doctor to talk about. Like, I was at the hospital with my mom just in the last couple days, and I'm saying I'm a neurologist and I'm talking like a neurologist, but I know if these people Google me, and see the things I talk about, they're going to be like, this person is like a Looney Tune, right? So there's that, but it's really been about unlearning. And I think so it's really important when we talk about like a lexicon is it's really bridging to this kind of uh, sometimes very rigid identity that a lot of us hold on to and rigid ideas. And this is, by the way, relevant to the psychedelics and why they're helpful. So I'm going to segue into that. But I think it's really learning how to become less attached to our identity, our ego, our importance, what we know, what our expertise is, which doesn't devalue that. It just creates more curiosity and more beginner's mind. So um, to segue then into why are people so interested in psychedelics, you know, there are a lot of conditions, and probably anyone listening to this podcast, whether they're a mental health care professional, or somebody who's navigating mental health, which there's a lot of overlap,
Right.
right? And what we know is that a lot of these conditions, and I'm talking from a medical and mental health standpoint. I'm not even talking about from an indigenous standpoint. We could go there,
Mhm.
but what we know is that a lot of what's happening in these conditions has to do with cellular memory,
Mhm.
and which has to do with the fact that our cells are in fact intelligent. They do understand um, inputs, that are not just physical, but also mental, emotional, and spiritual, are literally on a cellular level, on a mitochondrial level. The configuration of our mitochondria changes when our cells are in protection or defense mode, right? And a cell danger mode. Our mitochondria look different. They look like meatballs instead of like branch spaghetti that like is in community and exchanging information and exchanging nutrients and releasing waste. So on a granular mitochondrial organelle level, our cells remember,
Mhm.
and they respond therefore differently. And that's what physical and mental health conditions um, look like in many cases on a cellular level.
Right.
So this cellular memory is something that gets embedded
Mhm.
in our bodies and
Right.
expresses in these ways: the autoimmunity, chronic pain, mental health issues, neurologic issues, cancer, and so on. And I'm not saying it's the only thing, but it is I think we're discovering, pivotal,
Mhm.
foundational.
Right.
It sets the stage, and it also kind of plays a role until we intervene, right? So there's this rigidity, back to this idea of identity and who we are and what our stories are and what our narratives are, that need to be interrupted in order for us to really heal from these conditions that are very difficult to treat, right? All of what I just named, very difficult in conventional medicine and even, frankly, in functional medicine, not
Right.
always easy to treat. And what psychedelics can do is they interrupt these cellular memories. They interrupt these rigid pathways, these rigid narratives, these ideas that we have about our identity, and
Right.
so on. And we can get into the physiology. And in my book, I get very deeply into it, I think in an interesting way, I hope. I don't like things that are boring. So hopefully I don't say it in a boring way, but you
Right.
know, it's very exciting. And what I think a lot of people may not know is that almost every major academic institution in the world right now
Mhm.
has psychedelic research as a mainstay of their research, and you know, we're having papers published weekly, very exciting papers showing 1 or 2 doses of larger doses, with professional support before, during, after. I always want to mention that part because I think it's important to know. Doesn't mean it's necessary always, but that's what the studies all you know, include. So
Mhm.
it's important to be aware of that. Um, you know, lifelong refractory mental health and physical health. Now we're seeing conditions, depression, addiction, uh,
Mhm.
sexual trauma, OCD, PTSD, crippling potentially conditions. Now we're seeing with dementia, Parkinson's, you know, many others. We're seeing real improvement.
Mhm.
So it's very exciting.
Mhm.
And part of why I actually am out here talking about it is not because I'm so in love with psychedelics myself, but because I actually think it's very important to understand, and this can take us into the conversation about master plants and what they
Mhm.
are, but to come in a really reverent, respectful way for the power of this kind of treatment, to understand that it is not a magic pill. It
Mhm.
never will be a magic pill. The name of my training program around psychedelics, the Psychedelic Informed Practitioner Program, is Portal. The reason why it's called Portal is because I think of psychedelics as being a portal, right? You open the door, open the window. You can see a
Right.
lot of things that you couldn't see before, but then you are the one responsible for walking through the door, you know, and taking the action and bringing into your life what you were shown. So yeah, I think I'll pause there, and hopefully, you know, that gave people at least some sense of where I'm at with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I like the way you talk about the cellular, I don't know why I can't speak today, cellular memory, and how trauma is in the body and it is in the cells. And we talk a lot about that from a functional medicine standpoint, where we want to release that emotional trauma that's in the body. The body keeps the score, and how the ACE score can impact us. And there's so much research about that. And I've talked about that in previous podcasts. So this audience is familiar with the ACE score, but how it really does hold on in a rigid way almost, and people are stuck in these ways. And I feel like the psychedelics, like you said, and you explained it beautifully, it offers an opportunity to change, but it gives you permission to make choices, as opposed to just going down this roller coaster, so to speak, right? And I think it's a matter of doing it safely and with supports. But can you talk more about how that's all connected in terms of mental and physical conditions and the cellular memory?
Yeah, well, I think like one of the most important things that probably a lot of people are at least peripherally aware of is that psychedelics do something very specific, which is they open critical periods of plasticity. So, uh,
Mhm.
thinking about what a critical period of plasticity, if you're not a nerdy neurologist like myself, this may never have crossed your mind in the past, but how do we as children, as infants, for example, and young children, how do we learn how to walk and talk and potty train and learn the rules of our family and of our community and of our society and how to interact with other people, et cetera, right? All in this very short amount of time.
Mhm.
And it's through these particular critical periods of plasticity, which make any experience that we have embed
Mhm.
very easily. Okay, and those windows are open um, just for periods of time, brief periods of time, and this is part of why things like ACE scores, which just I know you've talked about it, but like what the ACE scores are measuring things that are fairly common. From
Mhm.
I'm not saying they're normal, but they are certainly not uncommon for many people to have one or more of those experiences. And what we're learning too is that it's not just capital T trauma, but kind of small t trauma, right? Being bullied or feeling neglected. And it can be your own experience, your own interpretation of a particular family dynamic, right? So one person might walk out of their family and be like, that was, I had a wonderful childhood. And another person is like, I was abused, right? And people are like, what? No, right? So this has to do with people's experience of big T, little t trauma, and then these critical periods of plasticity. And, when I was in my training, I was taught, as probably you were, that, plasticity is only briefly there, and then basically after you turn, like, I don't know, 21 or whatever, like everything's downhill and you never make any new connections again in your brain and so on. And of course we know now that we have plasticity in a number of ways, and we can enhance it in a number of ways. I mean, exercise and fasting and nature, and on and on and on. And, most of those things don't open these critical periods of plasticity in the way that something like psychedelics fairly reliably can do.
Mhm.
Now, there are caveats, like if someone's been on SSRIs for a long time, can actually blunt the effect, because one of the ways that they work, and it's very, very cool physiology, is through 5-HT2A serotonin receptors, but not the ones on the outside of the cell. They're actually, it turns out, intracellular 5-HT2A receptors that, right? Because why doesn't just our endogenous serotonin cause us to
Yeah.
have, psychedelic experiences, or SSRIs for that matter? So that SSRIs can actually blunt the psychedelic response in certain cases. So there are things that kind of can interfere, but for many, many people, what happens is we're opening this critical period of plasticity. The thing is, we can't get too excited about that, right? Because on the one hand, yes, we have this plasticity, new connections. We can kind of get out of these rigid ways of thinking. And I can even talk a little more on a, larger kind of uh, systemic brain scale on why that actually is helpful. Um, but the thing about critical periods of plasticity, as we see in childhood trauma embeds in a way that like adult trauma rarely embeds. It's very hard to recover from childhood trauma, as opposed to what may happen in adulthood, setting aside PTSD and things like that. And so it's important to be aware that if we're opening those critical periods of plasticity, we also need to understand there's a danger, right? If you're not held in a sense of safety, uh, again, right, this support before, during, after, um, then you actually can re-traumatize yourself, and in a way that you might not otherwise. And I've given lots of talks and lots of grand rounds at a lot of conferences on psychedelics, and people come up to me and confide in me afterwards, right? And like all the people you never knew had gone to an ayahuasca ceremony or whatever, but I hear the stories of people who feel like they were traumatized and really are struggling to recover. So I just, because there is a lot of rah, rah, rah in the psychedelic movement, and nobody wants to hear anything negative. And it's not that this is negative, but I will say from my indigenous teachers, they do not say, they don't talk about psychedelics. First of all, they're like, ugh, what is that? Psychedelics, right? I mean, they talk about master plants. So, but when they talk about master plants, you know, they don't say they're good and they don't say they're bad. They say they're powerful,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's about your relationship with power. How do you navigate your relationship with power? Do you come with humility and reverence and curiosity, or are you, you know, kind of thinking you're going to control it and commoditize it, et cetera? And that can determine how you come out of that period of plasticity and whether it's something that's healing or not.
Right, right. So yeah, it's important to have informed consent about this. And I'm glad you're talking about it, because you're absolutely right. There are a lot of people who have, not the best experience. And but I think every experience is valuable on some level, even if it wasn't the best experience. But again, I think it's important to have that support and that understanding going into it, so that you can make decisions while you're in that place. So I'm glad you explained it beautifully. So can you talk more about how you mentioned it, but I would love for you to talk more about how psychedelics work in our bodies and our brains. Like, what does it actually do?
Yeah. Yeah. So we talked a little bit already about the serotonin receptors um, and how that actually influences plasticity. And, you know, probably a lot of people know that in depression, as an example, in significant depression, we actually see neurons with fewer synapses. They dissolve their synapses. They become literally like lonely neurons, like lonely people become, you know, actually have lonely neurons. And it's a very kind of poignant and beautiful example of like so within as without and so on. But you know, when we activate these serotonin receptors, and we can talk about like microdosing, macrodosing, because I do, you know, quantum dosing, all of these different ways of engaging, because I don't actually think that there's just one way to engage. There are reasons to consider one versus the other, but all of that to say that, you know, enhancing plasticity is basically creating new connections, right? And we do see this. We see with these lonely neurons, more and more and more synapses being created and connecting to parts of the brain that normally are not connected, right? Other neurons that were normally not connected, parts of brain that were normally not connected to other parts of the brain. So there's this way that we actually develop, practically speaking, and this has been demonstrated in a lot of studies that came out of Hopkins, which is a lot of the seminal research, a sense of openness that most people don't develop in adulthood. Like you're either kind of open and you maybe become less open oftentimes over the course of adulthood. And what was seen and measured is this sense of openness and connection and understanding things being connected to other things, right? That previously maybe people didn't have. And so there's that part, right? Where there's this plasticity and these new connections that allow for understanding in a different way. But then there's this other thing, which I personally find, and I could get very, very nerdy about this, but I'll let the people who want to go deeper read my book, just chapter 4, go look at it if you're into this. But because there's a lot of even cooler stuff that I'm going to mention. But briefly, there is something called the sigma-1 receptor. Most people have not heard of it, it turns out. I gave a grand rounds at like a big, you know, like thought leaders consortium with Jeff Bland, and I asked everybody who's heard of the sigma-1 receptor, and one person raised their hand. Who was that person? Jeff Bland. Not surprisingly. But the sigma-1 receptor is actually really important. It's at the juncture of mostly, it acts, I should say, at the juncture between the endoplasmic reticulum and the mitochondria, which sounds a lot of blah, 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 probably to most people. But what it is actually, it rescues our cells. It prevents apoptosis. It supports the mitochondria. And if you look at what we call diseases of civilization, okay, which are like all of those refractory conditions I talked about and many more, including autoimmunity, including cancer, including like retinopathy, including, TBI, right? Traumatic brain injury, birth injury, like a lot of these things, the sigma 1 receptor is very important. Now, why am I talking about this random receptor? Well, first of all, it's not so random. Second of all,
Mm-hmm.
DMT, which is found, it's a compound that's, well, it's actually, we ourselves make DMT. It's an endogenous psychedelic, okay? But it's found in things like ayahuasca. It's found in a number of, or actually, I should say, it's found in the ayahuasca brew,
Mm-hmm.
not specifically in the ayahuasca plant, but it's also found in a lot of psychedelics, right? So DMT is both in a lot of plants. It's made in our own human and animal central nervous systems in tiny amounts. And in a lot of psychedelics, it's activated more strongly. Okay. And that has to do with a lot of the psychedelic, what we think of as the trip, the journey, right? This sort of effect that most people associate with the psychedelics. The thing is that DMT, it turns out, activates the sigma 1 receptor.
Mm-hmm.
So what's happening, and I just think this is so exciting because people are, not making the connection in many cases, like, oh yes, it's good for mental health because of plasticity. No, it's more than that. It's actually protecting our cells and causing reversal of damage in the kinds of conditions that are far beyond just, and I don't want to say just mental health, but the whole body, the whole picture. So
Right.
that's a very exciting, I think, piece of science that I expect we are going to hear much, 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 much
Mm-hmm.
more about over time. And we do know that, and there are studies on this, more and more studies looking at like ayahuasca brew, for example, which is one kind of well known these days
Right.
psychedelic master plant, that uh, it actually activates mitochondrial function over the course of the experience in a dramatic kind of unprecedented way when people actually look at mitochondrial function.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Great. That was great. Great explanation. So you've mentioned the word master plan, and everybody's, I'm sure, waiting with bated breath. What does that really mean, and how is that different from what psychiatrists are using as psychedelics? And are there other master plans besides ayahuasca? You mentioned
Yeah.
that as a master plant, or is there others? Yeah.
Yeah. So master plants are basically an indigenous term, and this is not to say that indigenous people all think one way or all call things one way, but simply that this is sort of a commonality among many, many, many communities that work with these kinds of plants. A master plant is considered a teacher, right? So my teachers and the people that I've learned with do not consider master plants to be compounds or medicines or psychedelics, per se. Okay. They consider them to be masters, teachers, and they're considered to be actually ancient, in many cases, like family members, like kin, okay, where they call them grandmother, grandfather, or mother or father, that transmit ancient knowledge that is necessary to shift human consciousness and help us navigate the human experience that we wouldn't otherwise have and that we need. And so many people may not know that there is evidence from tens of thousands of years ago. Some of the oldest cave art, believe it or not, I discovered this actually while I was writing my book, when I was researching by accident, that a lot of cave art was not, I was taught it's like, oh, these primitive drawings that people wanted to say, this is how we hunt, right? Most cave art is actually deep, 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 deep in the bowels of caves. And that's why we are still discovering cave art. It's in pitch black, it's in low oxygen, it's in ceremonial, actually, kinds of environments. And very often there is either pictorial or DNA evidence of master plants, and that could be mushrooms, right? So master plants are not botanical term. It's flora, fauna, fungi that have this ability to change human consciousness. And to be clear about master plants, not all master plants are psychedelic. So coffee is a master plant. Cacao is a master plant. Tobacco is a master plant. And so if we think about these kinds of plants, they're very powerful. They change human behavior, right? I mean, think about what people will do. I will think, because I'm in a coffee phase of my life right now. I wasn't for a long time, but the pandemic kind of like made me need that ritual in some way. And so I engage with coffee, and I'll go quite a bit out of my way to have my coffee, right? And it's a very sacred time for me. Same with cacao, right? What will we do for chocolate? I feel like a lot, right? And same with tobacco. And so any plant, though, that is psychedelic is a master, right? So you are not necessarily required to be engaging with psychedelics to engage with a master plant. But if it is psychedelic, it's for sure a master plant. And what's important about these plants is um, they demand, in a sense, to be treated with reverence, right? And the communities that are the custodians of these plants for these many tens of thousands of years engage
Mhm.
as though they are sacred kin. Some examples of the plants that are psychedelic master plants, to your point, are not just ayahuasca, but also the psilocybe mushrooms. Or everyone talks about the magic mushrooms these days, or psilocybin. Psilocybin is actually a compound. It isn't it isn't the mushroom itself. And as we keep seeing again and again, also with cannabis, which is actually another master plant, the entourage effect we talk about, this very sexy term that, like, ooh, it turns out the whole plant is more powerful than just a compound. Herbalists, of course, have been saying that since forever.
Mhm.
Um, but so the psilocybe mushrooms, ayahuasca, peyote, um, uh, the wachuma, the San Pedro cactus, salvia is another one, iboga is another one. So um, there are a number, and I go through both history, science, and lore for many, not all, of course, because how could I in one book? But in one of the chapters of my book, I go through um, kind of each of those categories for many of the uh, kind of most known at this time
Right.
masterpieces.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah. I mean, I'm glad you gave the whole view, put an umbrella around the whole topic there. Yeah. So, I think, sometimes people think that they have to have, a certain type of psychedelic in a certain form in order to have what we call a trip, right? Or what people have called trips. And what you're talking about is that it's already kind of part of our culture on some level. And you mentioned chocolate and coffee, etc. But can we focus more on the psychedelics specifically, and go more into, you mentioned microdosing and macrodosing, and there's also this term quantum dosing. Can you talk more about how people receive this compound, so to speak, and the different forms that they're available?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think most people, when they hear about psychedelics,
Mhm.
I don't think this is a wild assumption on my part, they think about a trip. They
Mhm.
think about, seeing cool colors, or like, having visions, being totally out of commission for, you
Mhm.
know, 5 or more hours. Okay.
Mhm.
So that is what we would call a macrodose experience.
Mm.
And a lot of the studies that are done have been done using macrodose experiences. And there's a actually fairly simple reason for that. Beyond that, we are a more is more kind of culture,
Right.
right? Like you got to feel it to really know it's going to pack a punch. But also, just practically speaking, you need an IRB to approve a study ethically and so on. And these are, um, compounds, medicines, or what have you, right? Could be ketamine, could be LSD, could be MDMA. A lot of the compounds, not even just master plants, that are being looked at now, they they're not necessarily all widely available, right? Depends on the area you live in, etc. So having people come to a clinic, they get their pre experience support, They
Mhm.
have their experience. It has a beginning, it has an end. They're watched afterwards, and the study is done.
Right.
It's not as difficult as if you want to study microdosing. Microdosing is a sub-psychedelic dose.
Mhm.
And that sub-psychedelic dose could be, there's a whole variance of and range of dose there. So it isn't, oh, it's only this tiny or this much, because different people are different. And this is part of like what we explore in, any training that people would have, just to understand those kinds of aspects. But it's sub-psychedelic, meaning you're not going to have that big trip. Now, does that mean it doesn't alter how you experience things? It absolutely can, but not in a way that it compromises function. So some people will feel kind of euphoric, some people will feel more social. There are things that people might experience, and sometimes that is going to be more potent the next day than the day they actually might take the microdose. But it has been shown in limited studies, right? Because of course, are we going to give people small doses of what may or may not be, currently legal in their area, and send them out into the wild and not know what's going to happen, not be able to monitor? It's more complicated. And I mean, it just is. And so IRBs are loath to do things that are complicated. And, I think we all know about scientific research, like, you know, the simpler, the more concrete, the better. Nobody wants to have to infer. Nobody wants kind of, right? I remember getting into a whole uh like, I call it an argument. I'm not sure what to call it, but like really I said this whole idea of like a whole plant being the more healing, more
Right.
medicinal than a compound. And I was speaking to researchers, and they came up after and basically melted down, is what I would call it, because they did not like that. They're like, no, that's not how research is done. And I'm like, well, that's a limitation of research and you, but not a limit, not like the plant is going to compromise its complexity, right?
Right.
Um, so then
Yeah.
quantum, yeah, quantum dosing is then this very interesting and very probably the most out of the box way of thinking about these plants from a kind of Western or global North way of thinking. But in indigenous communities, vibrational medicine is very much a part of master plants of psychedelics. So someone who might, right, go to an ayahuasca ceremony, if anyone has, they'll have heard Icaros. Icaros are these songs. And the ayahuasquero, the person who's, trained and dieted with the plant, is going to sing these Icaros. And the Icaros are very powerful, like, might make you feel like you're going to throw up or cry or
Right.
come back into your body, calm down, etc. And they're considered to be as potent
Mhm.
as drinking the medicine.
Right.
Some ayahuasqueros only sing the Icaros. They take some of the brew and then they sing the Icaros. And
Mm.
so these aren't songs the ayahuasquero came up with. They are actually considered vibrational transmissions of the medicine of the plant that is offered by the plant to the ayahuasquero.
Mm.
And so it's a very different way of thinking about a relationship and what medicine is, right? We're starting to think a lot about what is, we call it quantum physics, quantum biology. It's very like markety, it's very new age, but there's really beautiful scientific literature. And I mean, I get as excited about scientific literature as the next person, maybe more. I love looking at indigenous wisdom and indigenous science, and then looking at how that overlaps or how it kind of weaves with modern science. And we're seeing really powerful and interesting data around how sound and how light, for example, are, and how, electromagnetic fields impact every part of our bodies, our brains, our minds. So,
Right.
so quantum dosing is actually like a quantum, right? Through sound, through vibration, through light. There's a way of kind of experiencing the medicine
Mhm.
without maybe even needing to ingest. So, like, I grow master plants. I grow an ayahuasca plant. I grow San Pedro cacti. I grow brugmansia, tobacco, and other very powerful master plants. And I don't consume my plants. I tend them, right? This is part of my service, right? I believe in reciprocity with master teachers.
Mhm.
So part of that for me is tending them. And in tending them, I discovered that I could feel very differently and experience a lot of the kinds of uh, downloads, I would say, or what have you, that you would normally associate with um, maybe consuming. And not that I'm tripping or that I was, but that I could access a kind of plasticity and a kind of way of seeing things that was very different. And so that was sort of the birth of Quantum Drops, which is a vibrational product, and it's made ceremonially with music of the plants, with medicine songs like Icaros, and at certain times of month, at certain times of year with the plant. So with the plant, but not from the plant. So there's no plant matter or material in the Quantum Drops. Now, of course, I was sort of charged with this by the plant, and we could talk about that if you want to, but I sort of explored it, never really thought I would be
Mhm.
doing vibrational medicine. That was like not on my agenda, but and so I was cautious because I'm a practical person and I can be very esoteric, but in the end, I want things to have real outcomes. And so I worked with them in kind of a beta way with my, with consent, with my like clients, with, students and so on. And then I started putting them out in the world. And what I discovered is like people would write back essays
Wow.
about their experience. Like not to send like I love it, but like I need to tell you about what happened, and like long, long like
Wow.
expositions of like how their lives have changed. And so
Hmm.
um, I don't think quantum drops are the only way to quantum dose. As I said, I grow the plants, and that for me is a way that I can quantum dose. And obviously this is a whole conversation in and of itself, but I love it for people who are sober, for people who are pregnant, for children, for people who are medically fragile or have other psychiatric contraindications, or who are just plain sensitive. Like I am a little canary, and my experiences, I have had some big experiences with psychedelics in my life. I don't do that very much, and I haven't needed to really to get very potent experiences, but many of them were very, very difficult for me. And I'm sure, having trauma in my childhood and things like that were part of it. But um, in addition to that, I mean, some of us are just very sensitive, and some of us don't feel called. And that's like, I think, a really important point I want to make is um, I don't think anyone should do psychedelics because they feel they should, or because they think they have to, or because people tell them to, but only because it speaks to them. Like you're hearing this, right? I am not telling people go out and try psychedelics. That is not my message. It's not my message in my book. But if you hear this, you heard about ayahuasca, or you heard about San Pedro, or you heard about the mushrooms, or quantum drops, right? Any of those things, and you feel like, ooh, the first thing I recommend is go learn about it, read about it,
Right.
let yourself feel that longing, right? And maybe you start with quantum drops, maybe you explore microdosing, maybe you read about them, maybe you look at pictures of them. I mean, go to for me, like the New York Botanical Garden has a massive ayahuasca plant. I love for people to just go visit that plant, right? But start to explore the call.
Mhm.
And that I think is truly, and I mean, it can be true with ketamine, it can be true with any of those things that you can feel like, oh my God, I
Right.
think that's I think that's it. That's what I need to do. And I do think that's something to pay attention to. You want to just be really educated, um,
Mhm.
no matter what. Not all microdosing, not all ayahuasca, not all any of these things are created equal either. So understanding the depth of how they're grown, who's working with them, nothing's been added to it. These days we really have to be thinking about all of those things. Um, all of that is part of it. And I know I'm making it sound probably a little complicated, where it would be nice to not to just be like, yeah, I just want to take it like I would take my Zoloft. But
Mhm.
that's not what this is, right?
Right.
These are really they're kind of divine, I think, in a way, and therefore, and they're beings in my mind, and therefore more complex.
Exactly. I agree with you. There's so many things that you just said, and I have so many thoughts and comments about it. So yeah, I really see this, I agree with you, first of all, about the research, because they're taking one little piece that they're researching out of the context of everything else that surrounds it. That's part of the healing process. So I know a friend who went to Ecuador and into the Amazon, hiked to this shaman's hut, and he created this safe place for her to have this experience. And it was the macrodosing, but very, very clear about what's going to happen. That you're going to get sick, you're most likely going to be throwing up, most likely having diarrhea, but that's all part of the experience, and just preparing and really caretaking her in this experience. And it's the whole surrounding. It's not just the plant, it's also the shaman. And he did sing for her during that whole time, and it was all night long, just took care of her the entire time. And she said it was an amazing experience. And so I think, how can you study something outside of the, like, all the parts of that matter just equally, as equal as, I would say, as that dose, or that chemical, or whatever you want to call it, that is now being studied. And so I think there are a lot of plants that are from the Amazon, that are part of that ritual, that sacredness that you're talking about, that we've extracted and we use it for cancer. We've gotten a lot of cancer medications from the Amazon, as well as other things. And so I think it's important to understand that there's probably more of a healing experience if you are actually using the full plant, I would imagine. So, and then, boy, you mentioned so many other things that I wanted to comment on that I'm now blanking on. But let's just go to the end. What can people expect in terms of actual outcomes when they're using psychedelics? What are
Mhm.
I don't want people to think that, as you said, that it is like, the thing that you have to have, and that it should be an invitation. That's what I wanted to say, that it really should be listening to your instincts. I don't think we spend enough time listening to our instincts and what drives us, and pay attention to. That's a part of you that's really important to listen to, and being quiet in a quiet space, and being quiet and listening. We've got so many things around us that are always taking our attention and being distracted by that. If you can settle yourself down and listen and see where it takes you, I think it would be it is part of that healing process. So yeah, we're coming to the end of our time, and I would love for you to just talk about some of the things that people have experienced as a result of using psychedelics. What are some of the positive experiences? Yes, there's obviously a risk of negative experiences, but what are some of the positive things that can come from using them?
Well, so I think that goes back to the idea of the unlearning. So
Mm-hmm.
maybe we come a little full circle here because, I mean, practically speaking, things like smoking, tobacco, alcohol use, refractory depression, right? I mean, PTSD, like things that are so difficult and complex to navigate in life, and can really compromise our ability to live in our fullest and most authentic way. These are things that can be addressed through these kinds of experiences, but they happen, to my mind and to my experience and to my observation, um, through this unlearning process. So, what I always what I would say is like most people, and I include myself in that, are really uncomfortable with the idea of uncertainty, the idea of not knowing, right? And I think one of the things that psychedelics do is they sort of create more tolerance for um, not knowing and
Mhm.
for this sort of ability to become more curious, to become more open to experiment. And all of these things, on a more, if I can get a little more spiritual and existential, I think, a lot of us, all of us, probably struggle to some degree with these identities that we've taken on, maybe to please other people or because we thought that would allow us to survive, as
Right.
kids, or so that we could be valued or we could feel valuable. And a lot of this, we could get into like, is it trauma? Is it this? What it is in my mind is wounding. And I think, as a pediatric neurologist, a lot of my work was, not all, was focused in children for many, many years. Um, you know, I just saw children in their primary wounding periods very often. And I believe that is a stage
Mhm.
of life. It looks different in different people. It's nothing we would ever wish for. It just is. And we don't get to choose always. And then we have to like understand and unravel where our authentic self and our purpose really, and where the medicine is in those wounds, and operate more and more courageously from those parts, in a purposeful way, right? So what am I saying? I'm saying that psychedelics, in this more existential spiritual way that I do believe strongly informs our physical and mental and emotional health, is it allows us to kind of become curious and more experimental, um and step into this more authentic way and playful
Mhm.
playful
Right.
way that makes us really, it's the whole reason we're here. And
Mhm.
it's what makes us feel alive, is to play and to be curious and to experiment and to understand ourselves in these different ways, and not to be in these straitjackets of identities, of stories, of narratives. Like, um, that's really what I think is possible,
Mhm.
um, in the highest
Right.
uh, kind of outcome that
Right.
we can see with psychedelics.
Right, right. It's almost like a letting go, a surrendering. And, we talk about, having a journey of your health by being curious. And if you can, at least I do, and I don't know if everybody does, but I talk a lot about being curious and being open to possibilities, and letting go of those um structured, or that rigid type of thinking, and the shoulds and the coulds. It should be this way. So, and it does unravel a lot of the symptoms that show up, that is manifested as a result of that rigidity, OCD being the classic type, but
Mhm.
or the fallout of having the rigidity, in terms of depression and anxiety. So, we try to get people to learn how to breathe and create space for yourself and meditate. And I feel like the psychedelics, like you say, are a portal to maybe speed that process up a little bit. And I feel like people who are curious are more likely to use psychedelics, or braver, I should say, braver to use. But I would imagine that everybody would have some benefit, like you said, if they're called to it. And I think that's a really good way to know whether or not it would be right for you, and that you wouldn't have a bad experience. And it's almost a way to know that, hey, I'm ready for this. I really am ready for this because I choose to be ready for this, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think the bad experience piece, and I don't want to, necessarily end on that either, but
Right.
But I think like the bad experience piece, it's sort of in vogue right now to say like there are no bad trips. There's just, you get the experience you need. And I think to some degree, just as in life, right? There are like, but I think in life we could say there are difficult experiences that we have and they're unequivocally sucky. Like they're unequivocally sucky. And, you know, our hope and mission,
Mhm.
should we so choose, is to make meaning of the sucky things that inevitably happen, sometimes hugely sucky things that nobody would look at that and say, wow, I see real value in that. That's for you to discover, right? To make the meaning. And I think that's true of psychedelic experiences. They can be sucky, really sucky. And I am not someone who's like, yes, you needed that. Maybe, okay, maybe that's true, but I don't want to get punched in the face. So, what I would say is if we can make meaning,
Right.
right? The whole goal is really to make meaning of our wounding. And that can happen from, a bad experience, whatever we want to say that is. Um, and a bad experience, in life as well, right? Is just
Absolutely.
that's where the healing is.
Absolutely. Yeah. The healing is in finding meaning in the bad experiences. And that's how you heal and repair as well, right? Is finding meaning. You're not going to be able to change the past.
No.
Not at all, but you can try to learn from it. What can I gain from this? What can I learn about myself from this? And how can I change my response for the future? Right, it's just being aware, and so it is creating space for that healing that's really, really important. So yeah, so Dr. Maya, thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us today and talking about psychedelics. It was really, really valuable. I think I learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone who listens to this podcast learns a lot, and hopefully they will learn more about getting your book if they really wanted to do a deep dive and maybe even try those drops. Can you just tell us on here, it'll be in the show notes, but just say here for those who are just listening, to tell us where to find you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Just easiest to go to drmaya.com. And I have lots of free resources there. You can find quantum drops there. You can find my book there, a lot of my courses and other offerings that I do one-on-one. And then quantumdrops.com is the other place if you want to kind of go into a deeper dive on quantum drops.
Awesome, awesome. And people, if they wanted to do the certification with you, that would be the same website.
drmaya.com. Yep.
Awesome. Everything is there. Awesome. Great. Well, thank you so much for this time. And I look forward to meeting you in person, maybe at some conference in the future. And yeah, so have a great day.
Thank you.